Hi everyone. I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands of which this meeting is taking place, the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nations. I pay my respect to their elders, both past and present, and those emerging, and to all Indigenous and Torres Strait Islanders who are witnessing this presentation. We have with us today Charles WALDHEIM. Charles WALDHEIM is a North American architect, urbanist, and educator. WALDHEIM's research examines the relations between landscape, ecology, and contemporary urbanism. He coined the term landscape urbanism to describe the emergent discourse and practices of landscape in relation to design, culture, and contemporary urbanization. On these topics, he is author of Landscape as Urbanism, a general theory, and editor of the Landscape Urbanism Reader. He has also authored and edited the books Stock in Detroit, Is Landscape Essays on Identity of Landscape, The Third Coast Atlas, and Cartographic Grounds, Projecting the Landscape Imaginary. WALDHEIM is the John E. Urban Professor at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design, where he directs the school's Office for Urbanization. He was the chair of landscape architecture at the GSD and was also recipient of the Rome Prize Fellowship from the North American Academy in Rome, the Visiting Scholar Research Fellowship at the Study Center of the Canadian Centre for Architecture, the Cullinan Chair at Rice University, and the Sanders Fellowship at the University of Michigan. Please help me welcome Charles WALDHEIM.
Thanks very much, Leire. That's a very kind introduction, and it's really lovely to see you and David again after what's been almost 4 years. And it's nice to be with you all this afternoon. First of all, I want to say it's been over a dozen years since I've been in Melbourne, and I feel very welcome again virtually. Wish I could be there with you in person, hopefully next time. And it's important to say that I hope that all of you and your families, your loved ones are staying well. I know that you've been doing better recently than we have in our culture, but I hope that all of you will be able to stay safe and we'll be able to get together again very, very soon. 12 years ago, when I was in Melbourne for the first time, I was introduced from some friends of mine to footy. Is that a thing? Australian women's football. And I was taken to my first match. And at that moment, I became a Richmond Tigers fan. I just have to disclose that. I don't know to what extent you guys have any time for watching sports. But there's been a couple of months here in the States when all of our sports were shut down. And so I've been watching Australian football and Korean baseball, among other things. It's really a pleasure to be with you. Thanks for the invitation. I am hoping to share today a little bit of the work I've been up to recently, and what I'm claiming is a return to a topic that's been with us for a very long time. So, under this rubric of the new heliomorphism, my claim is that there are already dozens of architects and urbanists around the world who are practicing in ways with a renewed engagement with solar performance. Now, as Leire mentioned, I was first in Melbourne a dozen years ago talking about landscape urbanism. I'm trained as an architect. I've been working on the contemporary city for most of my career, and it became clear in the 1990s that the future of that conversation was very much going to be playing out on a debate around landscape. This came as a bit of a shock to me because I wasn't trained in landscape architecture, but at the same time, over the past decades, it's been clear in many contexts that thinking through ecology, thinking through landscape has been quite productive for people interested in thinking about the contemporary public realm. I also want to say a word about the context in which I'm working. So I'm a faculty member at the Harvard GSD. So we have, architects, landscape architects, urban designers, urban planners. And I lead a research group there, which is called, as Leire mentioned, the Office for Urbanization. The office is just about 4 years old. So when David and Leire were just leaving the GSD to go to Melbourne, we were just beginning this work. And so it's been the relative few years. I should tell you, first and foremost, that we miss David and Leire enormously. It was a great loss, your gain. But I can also tell you that they were both at the GSD before I arrived, and they were both among the coolest faculty members here, but also consistently among the most sought after faculty from the point of view of our students and our junior faculty to work with. So congratulations on having poached them. I know you benefit from their proximity. The Office for Urbanization, our mandate is really to, in the context of a research group, work with cities, work with governments, work with NGOs, foundations, through sponsored research projects. In that regard, we've done a little bit of work to think about how is it that this kind of research through design sits in the context of a major research university. Now, I don't know the situation on your campus precisely, but on our campus, it's not always clear that across other schools, other departments, people know precisely where to put design. I think in many contexts across campus, people might think of design as something close to fashion or taste, culture. And to that, we start with this quote by Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon was the Nobel Prize-winning economist, political theorist. Simon wrote a book in 1969 called The Sciences of the Artificial, in which he tried to define design as an activity. Simon argued that the natural sciences were concerned primarily with describing how things are. Design, on the other hand, Simon argued, was concerned primarily with how things ought to be. And so that ought to be, that sense of an ethical valence has been important to us in framing the Office for Urbanization. In that context, our work is really to draw upon our school's history of design innovation, but to address societal and cultural conditions. We do this through developing speculative and projective urban scenarios through sponsorship with various entities. Our primary mission is to imagine alternative and better urban futures. And our vision ultimately is to try to reduce the time lag. We know that our students have enormous impact in the world. Our goal is to reduce the time lag between that their work and their impact. We've, in that regard, been working through a form of what we call design research. So this is not meant to compete with practice, right? So we're not doing consulting work. And so we've thought a little bit about what design research might be. And again, borrowing from Herbert Simon and others, we know that the work of designers, the context of design research is synthetic. It incorporates information relative to a project from a relatively diverse array of sources. We know that design research is characterized by your capacity to organize and visually represent very complex arrays of information. We know that this work often is deployed through simulations or scenario-based projections that reveal the latent potential for future conditions. We know that our work is most often propositional rather than simply empirical or descriptive. And finally, and perhaps the most subtle or slippery definition of design research, and one of the reasons that I think that we spend some time trying to clarify this for people on university campuses, is that the work of design research, the work that your faculty, your students are doing, these projects stand simultaneously as propositions for intervention in the world, but at the same moment they stand as the form of knowledge produced about the world in our discipline. And that double valence is something I think unique to the design fields. It's in that context that we sit alongside other research units, some that are more technical, some that are more policy or social science based, some that are more based in the natural sciences. And as we looked at the design school and we looked at the research units available, we perceived 4 years ago that there was a kind of gap with respect to design research relative to the future of cities. Our business model is that we work with entities, foundations, philanthropists, cities, governments. They give money for sponsored research projects. And with that money, we then hire staff. So we have 6 full-time staff and a couple of doctoral students that do this work to distinguish it from being, let's say, not student work. In that context, as we launched the Office of Urbanization 4 years ago, we thought it would be important to begin with one or more topics, and I'll share with you just briefly one of those topics, this notion of the so-called new heliomorphism. Our habit there, as opposed to me talking about what is going on there, was to invite a couple of other architects, friends of mine, Jeannie Gang on the left, Tom Main, Morphosis on the right, so 2 American architects of some visibility these days. And it's my claim in that conversation and for you this evening that they are 2 of these dozens of architects practicing around the world today, engaging in new economies of solar performance. One of the things that appeals to me about the topic is that it is as old a topic imaginable. You know, David and Leire will tell you that I'm very fond of these dusty, old, crusty topics that seem like everything's settled about them. They are already done. And returning to that topic, of course, we're mindful of that history. Some of the earliest regulations in the British right to light laws, some of the earliest controls on what you can build in the city come from that very basic Western tradition, that very basic human tradition that all of us should have access to sunlight, even though we're living in very dense cities. The mythical origin of planning in this culture with the 1916 kind of Commission on Building Districts and Restrictions final report really consolidates urban planning over a century ago, and it inscribes in the earliest description of planning as an activity the notion of the restriction of what's buildable to ensure access to light and air for everyone. In that 1916 zoning ordinance in New York, of course, we see not only the beginning of planning, but we also see the inscription of those regulations, not just in policy, but ultimately also in built form, right? So it's the inscription in policy, but also through formal parameters. What's more, those formal parameters were then described in the work of various cultural producers, architects, and urbanists, including Hugh Ferris, who published in 1929, The Metropolis of Tomorrow. So Ferris's imaginary of New York City encodes in cultural terms what had been originally policy inscribed in formal terms, right? So it's not enough just to have the policy, it's not enough just to have the laws and the regulation, not enough just to have the kind of the formal guidelines, but ultimately to describe them through cultural means, through the imaginary of the city. Of course, across the 20th century, this notion of access to light and air was a deep concern for many, many modernists. I'm showing you here some Bauhaus-style shadow studies, Walter Gropius, 1929, looking at the precise relationship between built form and access to sunlight. Ludwig Hilbersheimer, the German planner, and Bauhausler, who then came to IIT with Mies van der Rohe in Chicago in the 1930s, continued that work in America under the rubric of the new regional pattern, looking at the relationship between sunlight, latitude, and solar access. Of course, there's a longer durée history of that, but in Hilbersheimer's notion of this distributed horizontal regional pattern, everyone has access to sunlight, everyone has a minimum amount of access to land for cultivation and the like. Equally, we could look at the work of Victor Olje, his design with climate, and his reference to a bioclimatic approach to a kind of regionalism. This approach, both Hilbersheimer and Olje, has been really interesting to us in the Office of Urbanization as what we're describing in our work as a kind of new empiricism, or a return to a form of empiricism after a generation or so of kind of formal speculation, let's say. And in that regard, we're returning to the category of region, but through latitude. We're interested in a latitudinal contextualism as opposed to other forms of regional logic. To this, I want to introduce a figure that's maybe less well known than Olje or Gropius or Hilbersheimer, one Vladimir Matus. Vladimir Matus was a Canadian urban designer. He published this book, Design for Northern Climates, Cool Climate Planning, in 1988. This was at a moment, of course, at the ascendancy, the height of the Barcelona School. Everything was focused on the Mediterranean and architectural culture, and Matus responded to that by arguing for a very different approach in dealing with northern latitudes. In this book, Matus coins the term heliomorphic urban design, which is as close to the new heliomorphism as I've found in the literature. And in some ways, I think we owe Matus a debt of gratitude. His studies were building in some ways on the northern latitude, but continuing in a kind of suburban North American format, the interests of the Bauhaus. In this regard, perhaps the most interesting figure would be to reintroduce another American urbanist, a fellow called Ralph Knowles. You can see Ralph Knowles here in his laboratory that he called the Natural Forces Laboratory, using something called a heliodon. This is a kind of physical construct that would allow him to move light across physical models. Ralph Knowles was trained at MIT here in Cambridge with Kevin Lynch, among other people. And then he spent most of his career at the University of Southern California, where he developed his concept of the solar envelope. And his students did studies such as these kind of cardboard, kind of chipboard studies of the solar envelope as a something between policy and a formal guideline. The solar envelope was conceived by Knowles as a kind of zoning envelope, a kind of policy framework that would ensure, in formal terms, access to sunlight for all in the context of the contemporary city. And with his architecture students, he would engage in projects such as this, where they would build these elaborate models, in this case, kind of egg crate model, based on the parameters of the solar envelope. Fascinating work. I was very excited to share with my friend Tom Main that I had found this figure, Ralph Knowles, and Tom Main suggested that I had to go back to his own CV, because Tom Main, in fact, studied with Ralph Knowles at USC when Tom was studying there in his Bachelor of Architecture days. Tom Main suggested to me that he learned everything that he knew about architecture from Ralph Knowles by loading up these parameters and charging them toward these non-obvious or non-linear formal outcomes. If you want to read more about Knowles and the Natural Forces Laboratory, I would recommend to you this 2018 publication from the Harvard GSD and the Canadian Center for Architecture, published by Andrew Witt and Christopher Resnich on Ralph Knowles and the instrumentalized studio. This is a continuation of Andrew Witt's interest in design science. And again, a return to both a look at the sciences, the relationship between the sciences and architecture, in which they publish these kinds of studies that Knowles students produced over the course of many years at USC. Now, to back from that a little bit and expand the field, it's my claim that whereas most of the 20th century, or much of the 19th century for that matter, was concerned about the equitable access to a minimum amount of sunlight, that was a kind of linear, singular economy, let's say, we have before us today, in the past decade or so, an array of practices around the world that are quite divergent. We'll see practices that are engaged in solar harvesting, solar shading, the distribution of solar resources and performance, solar carving, so a whole array. And I'll briefly mention, in the time that we have with you this afternoon, just a couple examples of those. Again, here, the key thing is a solar economy. In the 19th and the 20th century, that solar economy was primarily a simple, linear, limiting growth to ensure access, a minimum access to all. But we now have a plurality of these activities. These are increasingly digital practices. They are increasingly latitudinally specific, and they are increasingly producing built work. I'll show you just a couple of examples to suggest a little bit of what I mean. With respect to solar shading, this is the Skidmore, Owings and Merrill scheme for the Kuwaiti Military Academy from 2010. It is a matte building. This is in a context where surficial temperatures regularly exceed 120 degrees Fahrenheit. I don't know precisely what that is in Celsius. I never quite in my years in Canada got up to speed on Celsius. But in this map building, you can see the Kuwait Military Academy is accommodating a range of activities across a kind of campus-like setting. And these openings, these perforations, are able to modulate sunlight and therefore microclimate with respect to the activities of the Kuwaiti Military Academy students over the course of the day, the month, and the year. A very different kind of project, AIDAS, doing this Al-Bahr Towers 2012, so-called dynamic shading. These are dynamic louvers that respond to various conditions, time of day, seasons. These panels open and close automatically. So this kind of automated dynamic shading becomes not only a thermal response, but equally a kind of architectonic expression. In this project by NBBJ Design, the idea of no shadow tower, this is a study from 5 years ago in which one tower serves as a heliostat, so the entire building serves as a heliostat to bounce solar capacity into the shadow of the other tower. That's an interesting study. And I know that we're all Melbourne all the time. I hesitate in this context to show you anything from that other town up the coast. But in this case, I think Jean Nouvel, Atelier Jean Nouvel's project for Central Park in Sydney, again, about 5-6 years ago, is notable here. In this case, 220 fixed reflective panels in this kind of crude section, the idea of the double heliostat bouncing sunlight into what would have otherwise been a shaded courtyard between the two towers. They're kind of stubby. Are these towers? I guess a tower, plinth, and a stub is what I would say. That notion of the heliostat, of course, has many, many other examples around the world. Similarly, in VRDV, again, about 5 years old now, their scheme for a tower in Vienna with a waist in which the carving of the waist reduces shadows on the adjacent parcels. You can see here the study of that in this diagram. And that idea of the solar carve being appropriate to the ground plane and the adjacent parcels in a way then giving additional height above in compensation for that. So from that broad overview, from that context, we began a couple of years ago in our research focusing on a couple of cities, beginning with New York, in this case, Manhattan Island. And we began a study of this question with respect to the new construction of residential buildings in Manhattan. You can see here this catalog from about 2001, so 15 years, 2001, 2016. And we're interested to identify, in this case, the kind of larger, bigger than a single building, let's say a full block residential projects. In this regard, of course, we can see and we can relate them to other projects around the world. But among the tendencies that we can see here are, first and foremost, these buildings have moved away from the simple vertical extrusion of parcels. It's no longer simply the vertical accumulation or reproduction of capital, and it's a much more complex game of bundling parcels and their associated air rights. It's trading development parcels one for the other, and then ultimately focusing on viewshed and solar access as the primary drivers. And this produces, again, some non-linear, some non-obvious outcomes. Again here, Atelier Jean Nouvel, their project for the parcel just over the Museum of Modern Art on West 53rd Street. This is from 2012, so almost a decade ago now. What's notable here, as you can see on the left, simple extrusion of the parcel, the idea of the setback. They're following here each of the 1916 zoning ordinance's parameters. But what's interesting is that in doing so, they still arrived at a point where Amanda Burden, the director of planning in the Bloomberg administration, said no, too tall, and sliced off the top of the building. In that context, we're in an interesting place where even though we have all these policies and planning regulations and guidelines, we live in a culture where increasingly built form is the resultant of a one-off negotiation. So even in the context of a strong mayor, strong director of planning like Bloomberg and Amanda Burden in New York City, we have a culture in which that 1916 zoning ordinance is really it's a guideline for the beginning of the negotiation rather than something that's fixed in formal terms. In that regard, of course, we also have the pressure from development interests to hire increasingly well-known and visible architects in the media, and for those architects to differentiate themselves in formal terms. I'm showing you here the project called Via on West 57th Street by Bjarke Ingels Group from 2016, so only 4 years ago. In projects such as this, you can see the forces acting on viewshed, the idea of bundling development rights and enabling kind of viewshed down the East River. But ultimately, a kind of a heliomorphic performative impetus is seen even in projects like this, which Bjarke Ingels is referred to as a court scraper, kind of the courtyard perimeter block being pulled up to shape both solar access, but also viewshed down the East River. Now, I'm not going to make any great claims about this diagram here, which is among the most anemic of kind of solar performative diagrams I've seen recently. But I do believe that Bjarke Ingels Group here is following a trend line that we can see in the work of many other architects practicing around the world. In this context, we should also note that there has been, of course, a return to a kind of anxiety, let's say, on behalf of many civic organizations. In this case, the Municipal Art Society in New York City published a report called The Accidental Skyline in 2013, in which they were returning to their traditional role as kind of gatekeepers of the proper city. In projects such as this, the Municipal Art Society often kind of raised the alarm about the new density, the new height, the new shadows. They're illustrating here in this GIF the impact of so-called super tall or super skinny buildings on Billionaires Row on Central Park South. And in that regard, of course, there have always been shadows on Central Park. Central Park South has always cast shadows on the park. At the same moment, we have returned to a new heightened sense of anxiety with respect to both the taste culture and the impact of these shadows on the park. You can see here that distinction on the left, 2016 shadows projected, Central Park South over the course of the coming decades. Now, again, I don't mean to make great claims for that, but I do believe that we are seeing a new emergence, a new set of conditions emerging in practice. My claim here is a simple one, that historically, in the 19th and in the 20th century, this question of solar access operated along an axis such as this, which is primarily economic. My argument is that this operated somewhere between a question of social equity on the one hand and capital accumulation or reproduction on the other hand. And that's, of course, a long-standing, dialectic in our field. But in that regard, I think much of the 19th and early 20th century planning policies, urban economic policies, land regulations, zoning ordinances, the notion of the gridiron itself, all of these are instruments in that very long debate between, the city of equality, the city of equity on the one hand, versus the city as a site of capital accumulation on the other. Of course, the American city has long tended toward the right end of this spectrum, has long tended toward, and certainly Manhattan has tended toward the extrusion of capital reproduction vertically, and it has paid, of course, some attention to the notion of minimum access to light and air, but it's nowhere near the tradition of European cities or other traditions of other cultures around the world. Today, or in the last decade or two, in the 21st century, it's my claim that we may be seeing something like another axis. In this regard, I would argue that we might be seeing something like an ecological or a biopolitical axis that operates between sunlight in the public realm on the one hand, or solar energy production on the other. As we see, increasingly, the surface of buildings is becoming contingent, coincident with the source of energy absorption and energy production. In this regard, we are increasingly seeing a trade-off in a very clear zero-sum game between using the surface of buildings to capture low or almost zero carbon solar energy, and thereby pushing greater shadows into the public realm, or the opposite, the increasing interest in reducing shadows in the public realm for ecological purposes, for public parks, for biodiversity, for flora and fauna, and thereby removing or reducing the amount of surface of the building available for energy production. At the intersection of that, I do believe Ralph Knowles' work and his conception of the solar envelope is with us today and is quite prescient. To return to Manhattan, I'll give you two more specific examples, one each by Jeannie Gang and Tom Main, my protagonists, to give you a little clearer sense of what I mean. This is a project coming out of Jeannie Gang's practice called Studio Gang Architects. It's called the Solar Carve Tower. Again, it's maybe a little stumpy to call it a tower, but I think it's a notable project nonetheless. You can see here on the left the rendering by Hugh Ferris, 1929, Metropolis of Tomorrow, and Jeannie Gang's rendering from almost a decade ago, the Solar Carve site. This was a project that was conceived for the west side of Manhattan. You can see here in this drawing, 10th Avenue, the East River at the bottom, that green line snaking through is the High Line. And you can see here 13th Street, 14th Street, and the West Side Highway. In red at the bottom, you can see the parcel as given, and the dotted in diagram shows you the as of right following the 1916 zoning ordinance, the volume that would have been implied by that particular reading of New York policy. Within that, you can see Jeannie Gang's rendering of the volume that the real estate pro forma for this residential condo and hotel building would actually build out. And to this, what Studio Gang Architects did was they proposed contravening a century or more of New York zoning law by moving the mass of the building onto the avenue and thereby reducing the amount of shadow on the public amenity of the High Line. I'm told, and I believe it to be true, that this is the first building to be granted this exception and constructed in Manhattan over that century. You can see here in this diagram the notion of carving away the building, putting more of the mass on 10th Avenue, obviating this century-old precept of tapering the buildings away as they get more vertical, and in so doing, providing sunlight on the High Line, but also this amenity deck. Taking that study further, you can see here that Studio Gang produces a very interesting kind of tessellated facade study. You can see that here in this kind of model and in a series of these 3D prints. That facade also comes to be one of the primary kind of architectural kind of features of the building, part of it, the character of the project. And I'm happy to say the building is in the ground. It's I think it's a really fascinating piece of work. And it's exemplary of this tendency, which is carving away and arguing for both upzoning, increasing development rights and heights, but also the idea that there is now a politic about where the sunlight should go. It's not simply a matter of everyone having the same pro forma, everyone being equal, but ultimately we see both developers, architects, urbanists arguing for some sunlight in certain places being more valuable than other sunlight. In this case, the notion of sunlight on the High Line for the Pete Udolph's gardens and the notion of the birds and the bees as public amenity and forms of biodiversity. In the same past decade, on the same island of Manhattan in New York, we can see another project that's taking a completely opposite tack, in this case, the work of Tom Main, Morphosis. This is a building project on Roosevelt Island for a new campus, a Cornell campus, and the first building there, the so-called Bloomberg Center that Morphosis has designed. You can see it here on the lower left. The campus design is by Skidmore, Owings and Merrill and James Corner Field Operations, and a range of very talented architects have been invited to do buildings. Tom Main, Morphosis doing the first of them. Now, Tom Main, Morphosis, and the leaders of the Cornell Tech campus agreed very early on that this campus and this first building would be net zero energy. And so that's a very aggressive target at this latitude in particular. And to do so through photovoltaic cells, PV array, means that in this case, the formal outcome of Tom Main's Morphosis building, drawing upon Ralph Knowles' conception, is an enormous roofscape of photovoltaic arrays, that roofscape being at least double the size of the building itself. It's a kind of aircraft carrier. It's kind of amazing. I think it's an extraordinary building. But in this case, I think we see the opposite, right? This building casts a shadow that's almost a mile long. It is an enormous shedscape of solar performance that comes directly out of that goal of having low or zero carbon energy production. Now, part of what appeals to me in this debate is the notion that I think both of those arguments, both Jeannie Gang's argument for not shadowing the High Line and having actual flora and fauna and biodiversity and public amenity, but also Tom Main's argument for having reduced carbon energy production, they're both ecological arguments, and they're both arguably good. I think in this regard, I do believe we're on the cusp of a new kind of biopolitical axis, let's say, in which what I mean by biopolitical is that it's no longer simply enough to say low buildings are good, tall buildings are bad, sunlight good, shadows bad, right? That was the kind of old economy. To that, we now have a biopolitic in which the idea of having either low carbon or zero carbon energy production on the one hand, or having sunlight in the open space, in the landscape, this trade-off is an interesting one, and it will make for, I think, a very interesting set of futures going forward. So in that context, in the time that we have left, I thought I would share with you just a couple of the projects we've been engaged in the office. As we said, we're a research group. We hire architects, landscape architects, urban designers, many of them graduates of the GSD, but also many of them graduates of other institutions to have normal labor relations. They have, health insurance and full-time employment. And with that staff, we propose these kind of alternative, unbuilt often projects. In this case, we started with a study of unbuilt Manhattan. We returned to the Manhattan gridiron, in this case, the famous kind of commissioner's grid of 1811, and the zoning ordinance and regulatory frameworks. And we said, Manhattan seems to be, relative to that framework, underbuilt. Because in fact, the city as built has not nearly come anywhere close to filling out the majority or the maximum of that envelope from the 1916 zoning ordinance. We've also done some studies such as these, looking at the particularity of that zoning ordinance. And in particular, we're interested in the maximization of that built volume, so maintaining FAR. We're interested to see, well, what might we do to reduce the impact of shadow while maximizing or maintaining the same volume of build out? And so again, I don't want to make great claims for these studies beyond the fact that we're interested in operating within strict parameters. We're interested in developing these studies around what you might think of as a form of relational modeling, let's say. And in that sense, I do feel like the broader project of parametricism, has really been kind of, I think, unfortunately, kind of misbranded or misunderstood. And we are interested in the idea of a new empiricism returning to these kind of empirical measures, but placing parameters, very precise parameters around urban form. In this work, we are interested in continuing the project of landscape urbanism, but by more precise terms, in part because I think landscape urbanism is at its strongest, it's at its strength when it includes not only strategies for landscape and ecological functioning, but equally when it has a very robust agenda about built form. So as landscape urbanism is now, let's say, in its operational phase, we won. It's found in dozens and dozens of programs around the world. It's dozens and dozens of practices. It's now available increasingly in built work. Our research is now tending toward the ecological performance parameters for urban form. And a part of what appeals to us in this notion of relational urban planning is not only, continuity with work of our friends around the world who have been engaged in landscape urbanism, but ultimately also this notion of having a more precise agenda about built form guidelines. And in this notion of the biopolitical, this notion of an argument about energy production versus biodiversity, and the notion that we can no longer simply imagine these simple trade-offs or simple, notions that everything that's green is good, and in which I think we as urbanists have some responsibility to think in more, let's say, rigorous ways, but also in more provocative ways. We do, of course, also engage in the teaching program of the school. And so I thought I would share with you an example of that teaching program. And then I'll conclude with one other design project from the research group within the office. We've been doing, through the office, quite a lot of work in South Florida. This is a view of Miami, in fact, Miami Beach, Florida. Miami Beach is among the cities that is the most vulnerable, the most exposed to anthropogenic climate change, sea level rise, increased storm event. The mean sea level, it is about +4 feet relative, and there is water in the streets in Miami Beach on a monthly basis. You can see here this notion of a limestone geology in which there's no dike or wall system that will keep the water out. The water will extrude directly up out of the limestone foundation of this part of the world. And we know, as Nicole Hernandez-Hammer said here 5 years ago, the infrastructure that we have in Miami is built for a world that doesn't exist anymore, right? And so the city is actively engaging us in the city of Miami Beach, contracted with our research group, and then we did a series of studies with students and researchers looking at these conditions. In this context, the heliomorphic agenda, the solar performance agenda, played a secondary role. So we began by looking at, in this case, the ecology of Biscayne Bay, a sort of very traditional or very straightforward landscape urbanist approach. In this case, the work of Boxia Wang, advised by me and our teaching team. We looked at the kind of mangrove ecology in the bay on the left, on the western edge of the barrier island. And from that ecological reading, developed a kind of prototypical landscape urbanist approach in which landform elevates the city, buys time, mitigates storm effect, and this kind of thing. As we do that, we're also interested to derive from that a block structure and an infrastructural organization in which this new city, this new Miami Beach, might in fact be more embedded in that ecological function. So you can see here in the diagrams on the right, the idea of vegetal systems, new forms of landform, the new vehicular and pedestrian circulation patterns, new hydrological and land ownership patterns. And then ultimately, we're interested to derive from that new urban form. And so in this kind of work, I think hopefully you can see some continuity with the landscape urbanist agenda, but at the same moment, a renewed interest or a return to questions of built form. In this study by Andrew Model, who's now teaching at the University of Tennessee, Andrew was interested in similar questions, looking at the impact of storm event, hurricanes as kind of perennial issue in this part of the world, beginning to elevate the city, but also build out into Biscayne Bay to buy depth, but also to dissipate wave action. Andrew was interested in using some interesting kind of hydrological modeling software to be able to mitigate that effect. And then again, the idea of to be able to derive not just a landscape response, not just a built kind of landform response, but ultimately a new shape of the city, a new gridiron, a new land parcel strategy, and new urban typologies. And those typologies in these studies posed the same question. That is, do you in Miami Beach want more sun or more shade? And what's interesting in that economy, of course, is now shade has become among the hottest topics in urbanism in the world today. I think it will clearly be a topic for the coming decades. And in a place like Miami Beach, there are very good reasons and very clear populations that argue for both. Of course, some want shade, some want sun, some want it at certain times of day, some others want it at different times of the year. And so in that economy of solar performance, this work is trying to get at an orchestration of different solar experiences, different solar conditions, but with an urban form that can orchestrate or choreograph that solar experience. This is, of course, building on the fact that Miami Beach is there not for any rational reasons. You wouldn't build a city there if you were clearly working as a rational urbanist. Miami Beach is there as an object of desire. People want to be in the sun. In this study by Jesse Yang, you can see that continuation of an interest in looking at the bay ecology, looking at the kind of strategies for deflecting the existing gridiron streets, and then again, elevating, kind of fortressing relative to storm event, and then separating up from the section to allow for sacrificial floors. This is now a very common vernacular in this part of the world, the idea of floodable lower floors. Most of the development pro forma, the new condos that they can't build fast enough in this part of the world, already imagine a sacrificial floor or two. They're also building into their operations the notion of holding their guests, these hotels and condos, the residents, but also their service staff on site, something like a cruise ship for a month or something in emergency preparedness planning. In this project by Ziwei Zhang, you can see again this kind of landscape urbanist agenda, looking at the mangrove, wave dissipation, the notion of building environments in which not only the mangrove but also the other species, the lacustrine or the sea-based economy will thrive in. And then again, using this kind of matrix of kind of topographic kind of topologies, then developing from that a kind of key plan in which ultimately we might be able to derive a new image of the city itself. Again, I don't want to spend more time on it than we have, and I want to get to a conversation with each of you about your context there. I remember in the week or two that I spent in Melbourne, spending time on the beach in St. Kilda and having just a fantastic relationship to solar experience and solar performance. And so I'm looking forward to chatting with you about those. I'll just close with a more recent piece of work. This is a piece of work that we did 2 years ago. We were invited by the municipal government of Seoul, South Korea, to be one of 10 groups from around the world that were called in to look at sites in Seoul that had been kind of developed in the course of research about the city that had been proving to be particularly problematic. So this was in the form of an exhibition, a kind of an ideas charrette. We were given a site in the Han River. You can see it here in this kind of aerial view. The Han River, as you may know, has been the kind of centerpiece of Korean civilization for millennia, and we were very pleased to have this site. And I think the organizers of the exhibition and the Seoul municipal government had in mind that we would be given the river in part because of a landscape urbanism agenda, and that cleaning the river and making it habitable, of course, these would be fundamental to us as they were. We brought to that landscape urbanism agenda, but we also began with this form of a kind of heliomorphic practice. For us, as I've mentioned, the notion of context being latitudinal as opposed to cultural or even climatological. In this kind of diagram following Olje, you can see here Seoul, Korea sitting at 18.5. In this regard, the notion of being relative to north and south. In these diagrams, you can see the relative proportion and also relative rotation relative to east-west or north-south. That is a kind of optimal thermal response following Olje. In this regard, of course, the latitude gives us solar angle and solar response seasonally. But from that, we can also derive relative proportion. We know, of course, in an abstract sense, that block structure wants to be, as it approaches the North or South Pole, as close to maximum volume, minimum surface area as possible. So it tends toward the cubic or the shape of a sphere. Closer to the equator, it wants to be in a proportion that's longer and thinner and organized east-west with kind of available winds. And then, of course, around the tropics of Cancer and Capricorn, around the 45-degree mark, it wants to be about half of those two things. And so based on that, through the office, we've developed workflow in which, based on the latitude, we can also derive block proportion. You can see that here. If we add to that the notion of the Köppen-Geiger climate zone, this notion of precipitation, humidity, etc., we can place Seoul, Korea very precisely in a parcel ratio or block structure. And from that block structure, we can then begin to derive a kind of optimization or some empirically derived urban form. To that, we also do a kind of historical analysis of building trends. So we looked at particularly the development of taller buildings in Seoul over the course of the past half century. And we noticed from that tendency, a trend projecting forward of certain proportions and heights over time. And from that and the population demographic demands, we derived a certain volume of accommodation, a certain housing program for these residential towers above the Han River, in which both the historic growth of buildings over time, as we projected forward to 2050 or 2100, which was the kind of, in some ways, a kind of framework for thinking about the future, these kind of super thin, super tall towers accommodated the kinds of volumes of population that Seoul was looking to accommodate over time. And in so doing, of course, we were mindful of beginning with remediating the river itself. You can see here a kind of plan view of the Han River with the idea of remediating by redirecting the flows of the river. Of course, landscape urbanism has gotten quite sophisticated at this kind of work. And then stabilizing landform, building habitat for different species. As you know, this kind of work often begins with identifying the charismatic species. This kind of diagram, of course, is now, kind of very typical of landscape urbanist practice, in which we identify the kinds of creatures that we want to support in this form of biodiversity, the kinds of creatures that we want to live with. But then to that, we've been trying to develop an argument for the biofunctioning of the building mass itself. In this case, absorbing cool water, the notion of evaporative cooling, using the notion of what could be geothermal in another context, but as opposed to very deep wells, pulling water from the Han River itself as a form of evaporative cooling is one strategy. We brought to that a skin argument, which was really about a differential kind of relational kind of modeled skin that would do three distinct things. The first thing it would do is it would, on 1/3 of the skin, absorb sunlight for low or zero carbon energy production through photovoltaics. The second thing it would do is it would emit light that would enable illumination and social life and human reproduction. And then the third thing it would do is it would reflect light, both to shield the residents of these towers, but also to bounce light in a kind of heliostat format into the shadow of the adjacent paired tower. And at this point, I think you can see, hopefully, this practice is building upon some of the lessons learned from other things. We also are fans of what my friend Andres Duani and the New Urbanists have called visual biophilia. I don't know where that conversation is in Australia or in Melbourne, but I can tell you in many parts of the world, there is great enthusiasm for this notion of the building itself becoming forms of habitat. And in this regard to that landscape urbanism work, we're trying to bring a kind of sectional approach in which these 500-meter or taller towers can in fact be thought about as different populations, different habitats at different points vertically. Again, I won't make any broader claims for the project beyond that, other than we're interested in using projects like this, not to suggest that these will be buildable or that in fact even it would be a good idea to build in this way, but rather as a kind of study of the potential that we exist within today in contemporary practice through this notion of design research, revealing the potentials both culturally but also architecturally and urbanistically going forward. So thanks very much for joining me. It's nice to be with you here. I know that you guys have a busy day. It's lunchtime. There's many reviews to get back to and other things to get on with in your schedule. So I want to hopefully engage in a conversation, be happy to answer any questions that you guys might have. Thanks very much.
Hey, Charles. Thank you very much for that presentation. It was a great presentation. So we'll probably have around 20 to 30 minutes of feedback and basically talking and questions from the audience. So we're already starting to get quite a few questions here. So maybe I'll just get started with a question from the audience. So actually, Professor Donald Bates wanted to congratulate you on your footy team, Richmond, winning the championships this year. So I didn't know that you were a Richmond fan. So it seems that's
true.
The case.
It's true and timely. Yeah, I lost track of where the Cats. I mean, the headline that I read, I wasn't able to watch it. The timing didn't work, but the headline I read in the paper online was Tigers Maul Cats, and I lost track of where the Cats were from. So hopefully there are no Cat supporters. But yeah, I was very pleased.
Right. But he follows up with a question. So he's asking, is there a conversation about the role of shadows? So in the discourse, it seems always assumed that the shadows are the loss of light, in inverted commas, and therefore shadows represent a sense of commodification of the sun. But in many instances, shadows are a necessary device/technique to deal with heat, solar gain, and comfort. It would seem that part of the role of the Morphosis project on Roosevelt Island is not just to provide a large surface area for energy production, but also as a shading device for a large public field, high enough up in the air to provide ambient lights spreading underneath the roof, but also mediating the sun, with the sun itself an increasingly climatic factor. Yeah.
Thanks, Donald, very much for the question. I think it's really well put. And this has been, in fact, one of my own learning curves recently. In the past year or 18 months, it's become clear to me, as I mentioned, that this the economy of shade will be one of the drivers going forward. I've seen this in a variety of places. I recently interviewed a fellow called Christopher Hawthorne in a podcast series that we organized called The Future of the American City. Christopher Hawthorne was originally the architecture critic of the Los Angeles Times newspaper. He's most recently been appointed as the chief design officer for the city of Los Angeles. He works in the mayor's office. And this was one of his primary initiatives in the past 6 months, has been the notion of the distribution of shade, and his argument in a place like Southern California that in fact, disproportionately heat affects the lack of access to shade along class and race lines is an enormous public health issue. We know in terms of heat event that heat events are among the most pathological climatological events in North America. I'm sure it's the same in Australia, perhaps even worse given your proximity to sun. And so in that regard, you're absolutely right to suggest that in fact, even my conversation, even my understanding today is still too solar centric. And I'm much more clear on the notion that in fact the equitable distribution of shade, access to shade, not just for the wealthy, not just for the luxury, but also for everyone, will become an issue. And that's setting aside the implication that you hint at in the question about the poetics of the shadow, which of course the kind of lived experience, the quality of it, but purely on climatological terms. I know, for example, Vienna has it as one of its primary agendas. As that part of Europe heats up, its population ages, they have enormous challenges, and it's again one of their major urban agendas. And so going forward, my spring studio, spring of 2021, is going to look at questions of shade relative to Los Angeles, because I agree completely that shade and the kind of modulation of shade and shadow will become a key economy going forward.
We have another question here from Heinz van Eckertsburg. He says, I love the idea of urban form differing to or being more carefully inflected by the interests of the public realm. It seems that this could form a more holistic barometer for how buildings and the resulting spaces around them can be measurably successful. So as an American and an urbanist, I think it's difficult to address the history of planning without treading into racial inequity and the resulting city form. Many of the issues that many of the issues addressed within ecological urbanism disproportionately affect these groups. How do you see your work at the Office for Urbanization contending with these challenging questions?
Thanks very much, Heinz. I think it's a great question, and it's absolutely true. The first thing that I would say is that in our culture, and I've been saying this for a few years, and I think it's true, we seem to have lost the capacity for thinking about or even imagining collective outcomes. That's been happening for a long time now. But even in the context of the 20th century, even in the context of the welfare state and the New Deal, we could somehow have a conversation about, collective outcomes versus individual expression, individual capital, individual land ownership. Now, we do live in a culture which, coming from ancient British law, in which property ownership is absolute and has very few limits on it. But in that context, the development of planning, the development of urban design, the tools that we've developed in the 20th century, I do think they have attempted, and I think Manhattan is a good example, where the gridiron and the shaping of the built form regulations, even though those are instruments of capital reproduction, absolutely a project of real estate development, absolutely erasing existing communities, at the same moment, they also inscribed some modicum of collectivity. There's some modicum of equality, so there's some sense about every block being equal. At the same moment, of course, I think with the neoliberal economy that we live in today, as I tried to show, increasingly every project is a one-off negotiation. And so even in very strong mayor, strong planning cultures, I think in Canada, I spent a number of years in Toronto, and I think our neighbors to the north do a better job of it, frankly. I think there's a much greater sense there of civic responsibility, even though they have their challenges. If you look at Vancouver or Toronto, I think they're doing a better job than we are in the United States in thinking about collective outcome in larger urban projects. And that's also had an impact, I think, in architectural culture, so that I'm enormous fans of Jeannie Gang and Tom Mayne. I think these are among the most interesting architects practicing today. the nature of practice is such that there are very few commissions, very few opportunities for thinking about something beyond the individual building. So even in progressive practice, even with architects that want to do the right thing ecologically, the nature of practice, the nature of commissions, the nature of the economy is such that we tend to not be able to think about collective outcomes. And to that, I think that's one role that the university can play. And so in the Office of Urbanization, I'm committed to the notion of taking aspects of practice that seem evident, putting a mirror up to them, but then scaling up to see, well, what would the implication be for that form of collectivity? It's absolutely true that, of course, the history of urbanization, the history of urban planning in our culture has been built along questions of race and class. And in fact, the racist redlining, the erasure of African-American communities, that history of erasure and denial we're still dealing with. And of course, we've only just begun to reconsider those histories, to revisit those histories. But what's important in this context to suggest is that the notion of urban renewal, the notion of erasing communities, kind of vibrant, especially African-American communities in many cities, the building of highways to demolish or cut through these communities, those were the best ideas of the progressive era. These were not ideas that came from the right. These were ideas that came out of the New Deal, right? These were the best ideas of the progressives in their fields. And I think we've learned from that. We've internalized, I think, an appropriate sense of humility with respect to large-scale planning. We're still just beginning in our culture to come to terms with the history of racialized violence, the notion of Black bodies in particular as sites of state violence, and there's much more work to be done on those scores. In that context, we have enormous challenges in the absence of thinking about big projects. We have big challenges, both societally, but also in terms of climate, environment, and economy. So I think we're at a tipping point where I'm hopeful that we'll be able to think more collectively, and I'm hopeful that we'll be able to think about collective spatial outcomes and to move beyond just the simple reproduction of individual actors and individual building projects.
Yeah, so maybe I'll just try and slip in one or two questions from my side. I guess one of the things that I find interesting is this, the deliberate adoption of the idea of urbanization. You've called yourself the Office for Urbanization. And in many ways, there's a kind of suggestion of the marriage of the technical and the imaginary. So, or maybe it's more the pursuit of wider effects or wider, like say, reverberances about the collective or the imaginary through a deep engagement with technique and the technical, right, somehow. So, there's that tradition of urbanization, particularly in through the theory of Serdar, which is very much kind of systematic idea of urbanization or urbanism. Is there a reason, is one of the reasons for adopting that urbanization as the mandate for your office, an idea that it could formulate an adaptable or flexible template for urbanism generally at large, perhaps? Or I don't know. Yeah.
Thanks, David. Those are kind words. I think if we could aspire to that, I'd be very happy, with the work that we're doing. Sorry, go on, Charles. Go no, I guess the other issue is also the kind of investment or the kind of faith in the idea that we can actually produce much wider resonances and effects through an engagement with the technical, right? That's kind of an interesting thing for me as well. I'm just wondering if you could speak to that a little bit. Yeah. Sure, yeah. So first of all, with respect to the handle, I do believe, I'm a close reader of this guy, Ludwig Hilbersheimer, and I tend to follow a little bit of interest in the way that he positioned his work relative to these larger forces, right? So Hilbersheimer is a committed socialist, and yet he quotes Henry Ford about the shape of the city because he understood these larger economic and political forces, these cultural forces. His work is really a cultural expression of, but also insulating populations from. So we chose the term urbanization to reflect that. This is not urbanism where we have a department and we know everything. We profess to have a command of knowledge. It's that it's happening. And by urbanization, it's a process that's well outside of our control. It's certainly an ongoing process. And in that regard, the notion that we could study those processes of urbanization and bring certain tools, and I appreciate your comments about the technical. I think in part because of the failure of 20th century planning and the kind of sins of our grandfathers, I think, the first thing I was taught in architecture school was that, we got it wrong and we shouldn't think big anymore. And we've also tended, therefore, to kind of recede away from thinking that there is technical knowledge or there are tools available to address these things. And I'm optimistic that, in fact, to the extent we can ask interesting questions, socially engaged questions, environmentally engaged questions, these tools can be helpful for us. But I think you and I, we share a kind of burden, which is oftentimes these tools, both the techniques, but also the workflows and the conceptions around them, have been used for kind of silly or trivial ends. And a part of my interest is, to not be the first adopter of them. We make no claims in our work. We don't originate any of that stuff. I want to be like right behind that, looking to techniques that are interesting for people and seeing if we can't adopt them and apply them as tools to social or, kind of urban problems, let's say. So right now, the thing that we're working on is a study of so-called, neural networks or machine learning. We're working with the Getty Institute. They've acquired Ed Ruscha's, thousands and thousands of photographs of the streets of LA, and we're training machines, so I don't know anything about AI, but it's clear to me that ability, that kind of latency to read into those images. So in that sense, we want to be kind of late adopters of tools that seem relevant, but apply them to urban challenges. And in that sense, I do believe that if we can get in front of decision makers, I do think we can make some recommendations that might be able to help inform their choices.
Right. So I'll pick another question from the audience. So Ted Bayou asks, and I'm assuming that this is referring to a particular comment that you might have been made earlier, but he's asking whether it's irrational or political, or is it winners and losers, or all winners or all losers? And
thanks, yeah. Ted. I love this chat thing, so I can actually read, like you guys type the question, I can read it. Okay. It's cool. Thank you for that, and thanks, David, for reading them out. I miss not being in Melbourne with you, and I'll miss a nice dinner and a glass of wine with you. But I think some of these things are actually better. I don't know what your experience has been. So Ted, I think it's a great way of kind of becoming a little bit more focused. So from my point of view, I guess what I want to suggest is there are things that are forms of professional knowledge, right? There are things that we know, things that we can say that we know, whether it's technical or professional. And then there are also recommendations, that we can make, but that ultimately those recommendations go into civil society. The vast majority of work we do is in forms of, democratic governance, whether it's, in the US or in Latin America or Korea. We're committed to working in places that have, civil society and forms of democratic governance. And in those, of course, we're not the deciders. Like, we don't decide these outcomes. But I do think that we have the ability and in some ways the mandate to be able to illustrate, to imagine these things, and then therefore to show people. So one of the things that we do often in our work is what we call a scenario zero. So when we're working with mayors or directors of city planning, we're working with foundations or even real estate markets or real estate developers, many of these actors, they have a vested interest in a kind of image of stability. Like, they imagine the world that they've built is stable. They want it to be that way. And all of them are somehow dining out or being reelected or being, renegotiated based on continuity. And so often we'll do a scenario zero, which is what we'll do is we'll just do a scenario planning exercise where we say, well, let's assume Mr. Mayor or Ms. Director of Planning, let's say none of the steady state changes. The economy doesn't change, demographics continue. Let's play out 5, 10, 15, 20 years, and we show them the urban environments that are derived from that extrapolation. Like, that's kind of empirical work. It's a kind of design research where we're showing, here's the trend line. And that often is helpful in illustrating, first of all, how quickly and how drastically places are changing, but also how negative some of the outcomes can be. And we can do that in part because we have the technical knowledge, we have the tools, we can visualize things over time, but also because we don't have a vested interest. I'm happy to tell the mayor of the city of Miami Beach, like, here's the reality that we see. And we're in a culture, at least here in the United States, where, that kind of advice is difficult. City of Miami Beach sits in a state that has a governor of the state that will not allow the government to use the term climate change. So we literally have to play defense on science in our culture. And in that regard, a scenario zero look at sort of here's what's already happening oftentimes allows communities or civic leadership or elected or appointed leadership to see change, but in a slightly arm's length kind of way. So in that regard, of course, we don't presume to speak for the choices, the politics, the ownership interests, the capital expression. Those things are obviously ongoing, but we do try to bring some light to those choices. And therefore, most often, we're sponsored by people interested in a better public realm.
Yeah, so I think just those, so I believe Ted Bayou is actually an ex-premier of Victoria, actually. So you're speaking to governance. Maybe I'll change the tone a little bit and ask a more general question. So I remember when we were in Cambridge, there was this kind of origin story of landscape architecture that you present to the classes that we'd be teaching, related specifically using the figures of Olmsted and Val as a kind of an argument for, I guess, interdisciplinarity. I guess it's the beginning of a new model of practice in America, which kind of came out of this marriage of two very different viewpoints, right, somehow. So it's kind of interesting that Olmsted also at some point was a public health official, in that brief period when he was fired from Central Park, all of those sorts of things. So I'm just kind of curious about the role of interdisciplinarity in your work. I mean, particularly, landscape urbanism is something that really leveraged the capacity for opening up a new space for practice and theory to view and engage with the city that benefited from a lot of different, let's say, viewpoints and knowledge and, I guess, know-how. So just largely, if you could speak to that, the notion of interdisciplinarity and its use for us, I guess.
Sure. I mean, I take it that your faculty has multiple disciplines. I'm led to believe you guys have different flavors there as well.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think, you mentioned Olmsted, so, it never occurred to me that I would be interested in or spend time, dealing with the history of landscape architecture, but somehow, the notion that landscape would emerge as a key medium for thinking through the city, that was evident in the 90s, I think, to many, many people, particularly looking at the American city, but increasingly the global city. And in that regard, it initially appeared on the horizon as something really as a critique of urban design, basically. It was a critique of urban design or urbanism's inability, its retreat into formal responses, its inability to develop a kind of environmental position or ethic, let's say. So it was initially viewed from landscape architecture as something that was really from urban design. And then, like a lot of, cultural changes or disciplinary changes, it then appeared to be a kind of joke to landscape architecture, and then it was perceived as a threat, and then it was internalized. We were kind of swallowed into landscape architecture. That's not uncommon, I think, in the history of ideas. And I think oftentimes the most interesting ideas, maybe the most powerful ideas, they don't arise in the center of fields, right? As you know, they often arise in funny ways between disciplines or on the edges of things. I liked the Olmsted story in part because I think it may be hard for us to imagine now, but he was operating at a point in time in the 19th century where, artist, architect, engineer, gardener, these were available categories. And he said, no, that was not sufficient. The conditions of the industrial city, societal, strife, the, kind of living conditions of the industrial worker, immigrant culture and the kind of political pressures, not to mention the kind of huge environmental challenges, they required a new response. And the idea of a new field as a kind of radical claim. And I think, I'm not proposing that you should invent a new discipline every week, but I do think that it's, it's an interesting dialectic that on the one hand, we don't want to rename our discipline or our profession every time there's a new virus or a new, typhoon. But if we never revisit that origin, if we never review what we do, you can very easily end up like opera. I don't know. My friend Scott Cohen, when he was chair of architecture here at the GSD, when I was chair of landscape, he said he enjoyed us working together because his job as chair of architecture was to protect architecture from me. And there is this notion of the autonomy of architecture, and that's a little bit what I mean by opera in the sense that, I think for many people, the autonomy of architecture has meant to keep it from being engaged in these conditions in the world. And a part of my work has been, yes, to work between disciplines, but really to draw architecture out of its shell in a way, to re-engage with some of these societal, environmental, what some would think of as externalities. So in that regard, it's never been an ambition of mine to work across or between disciplines. But if you follow the ideas, I think many of us are interested in ideas in this line of work. If you follow the ideas that are the most pressing, most often I find them not to be sitting in the center of a particular field. And I don't know what the most current or interesting topics are for you guys. Right now, I can tell you for our culture, I think among the most interesting questions come out of what used to be thought of as conservation or preservation. The conservation, preservation topics today look a lot like landscape in the 90s to me. They're kind of everywhere. They're under-theorized. There are only a few programs, a few people doing interesting work. I don't know the situation in Melbourne, but I would say pursue your interests. You'll get good at those, and you may often find that the best new thinking is really just on the edge of a field. And as you develop that, you might be surprised, as I have been, as to which fields end up responding.
Right. So I think we might have maybe time just for maybe one or two more questions. So there is one question from the audience. Okay, so there's two actually. So I'll try and do these two. So someone's asking, undoubtedly the intersections of landscape urbanism approach and sea level rise in Miami is very interesting. I wish to know to what extent the notion of landscape urbanism could influence the communities in densely populated coastal cities where the internal floods are the major problem. So it's a bit related.
Yeah, it's a key question. I remember years ago when the Dutch were already exporting, kind of dikes and dams, and they were exporting their knowledge to every river delta city in the world. And I went to the Netherlands and was in conferences, and I learned that the Dutch are not concerned about the North Sea. They got that. That's fine. It's what's coming down the river from the Alps that they don't really have the ability, the political context to deal with. If you look at the risk map around these things, if you look at Dhaka or some places in Asia, I mean, they're incredible populations without the kinds of resources that you might imagine. And at the same moment, I do believe that in the context of the informal, broadly, let's say, the non-formal world, there are a number of our colleagues that are working on this notion of green infrastructure. There was a colleague of ours at the GSD, landscape architect called Christian Wirthmann. He's now chair at Hanover in Germany. He's been one of the people spearheading this notion of a kind of green infrastructure, kind of landscape urbanism playbook, but in the context of the non-formal city, whether it's in South Asia or in South America or other parts of the global South. In those contexts, I do believe that there's a role not just for the NGOs, not just for science, not just for kind of philanthropic or humanitarian work. I do believe there's a role for design, and I've been very pleased to see so many of my colleagues from the ETH Zurich, based in Singapore, doing work in Malaysia or parts of South or Southeast Asia. So in that regard, I do believe there are people out there doing more work on that than I have been that I would recommend you to. But if you look at that work, I think you'll see a lot of interesting, both innovative ideas, but also strategies.
Okay, and I'll just end with one last question from the audience, Charles. It's Alex Felsen, who's the new chair of landscape architecture here at the school. He just came from America. Yeah.
Congratulations.
He says, hi, Charles. Based on your discussion of building on historic knowledge and reapplying it in contemporary ways, as well as the challenges of working with cities such as Miami in terms of their beliefs in science, do you have thoughts about how to work effectively with indigenous knowledge or Aboriginal people, which is a growing area in Australia?
Well, hey, Alex, it's nice to reconnect with you. Congratulations on the appointment. I think, our loss is Melbourne's gain. It's nice to chat with you. I would say that I know that there are people that are working on this, quite a number of them, in both Canada and the US. In Canada, when I was at the University of Toronto, there was a conference organized by Alyssa North and the faculty there called Innate Terrain. This is about a decade ago or so. in which, because of Canada's relationship to the so-called First Nations populations and a slightly different footing relative, I don't know if this is common to the Commonwealth and where the conversation is in Australia, but in the United States, of course, we have this great history of genocides, complete erasure, which is ongoing, and in which urbanization has been a continual tool of that erasure. I think that we're only beginning to come to terms with that history. There is Julia Watson doing work at Columbia with respect to indigeneity and Aboriginal populations. In Toronto, there are a number of people working on the North in Canada, which ends up being a venue that both needs attention, but also surfaces quite a lot of these questions of indigeneity and identity with respect to land. And I would say it provides a real kind of powerful critique, I think, of many of the kind of assumptions about landscape architecture. My colleague here at the GSD, Pierre Belanger, had been, of course, focusing on that in his own work as well. So I'd point you to Julia Watson at Columbia, Pierre Belanger, Alyssa North, and others at Toronto. My guess is that there in Australia, there in Melbourne, you have experts, you have people that have been working on these histories and working with these communities for some time. And my guess is that from those conversations, you'd be in a better position, Alex, to tell us in the coming months, in the coming years, what you've found in that work.
Well, thank you very much, Charles, for a really kind of very interesting and inspirational talk. And thank you very much for sharing your time with us. I realize it must be very, very late for you over there now, so it's best to probably let you go now. I think I might have one or two announcements that need to come up.
Thanks very much, David.
No worries. Thank you very much, Charles. So it was meant to be for tonight, but I think it'll be postponed. There'll be a new date confirmed for Helen Fischow's talk with Jane Rendell, and stay tuned for that. On Wednesday, the 4th of November, we'll have Piyush Tiwari talking about on bank pricing of single-family residential home loans in Australia. On Thursday, the 5th of November, Valerie Francis will be talking about more than just Add Women in STIR, reflections and current work on women in construction. And finally, all of the talks that are done for MSD at Home are put onto the MSD YouTube homepage. So please feel free to watch these lectures at your leisure. Thank you very much.